The agency itself refused to see the realities on the ground where it was carrying out its allegedly capacity building work in order to raise the encouragement level and support level for traditional knowledge, intangible cultural heritage or living heritage. And this is the kind of gross internal contradiction that exists in every single of these agencies. When you look at what they ask you to do and then how they process what you tell them has happened. So a great deal of what has happened, in fact, is excised, it is censored, it is cut out, it is edited. And even that then becomes part of the grist to their propaganda mill, which we've already gone through. One of the traits or one of the characteristics of the British administration, the British Raj, that how much they invested in sending people out to document whatever there was. And then having amassed all that documentation, what they did with it and what uses they put it to, I think that's something that we still have to learn from, because this is something that is central to whatever I've done in the last 30 years. That look for those people, find them, speak to them, and write it down. Write it down. Of course, nowadays you can record it, but write it down and make sense of it, redistribute it. So this is something that they did with great efficacy in that administration, and they put it to use for their own colonial purposes. And of course, all the colonial powers did that. Hortus Malabaricus, which is the mammoth Dutch language compendium of the botanical diversity of Western India. Also 17th century was a standard botanical reference work until well into the early 20th century. So you can imagine the kind of effort and resources that were put into compiling this. And this is as far as our country is concerned, that is basically the Malabar coast and a little further up, maybe until Mangalore, Uttar Kannada. But they did exactly the same thing in this, what they called Batavia, which is Indonesia, which is the Dutch name for the colonial a part of Indonesia was called Batavia. They did exactly the same thing there. The Portuguese did this in East Africa, and so on. So this, as I was saying yesterday, this mania for making lists, making rosters, making catalogs, the reign of the encyclopedists. The 19th century in Europe was heavily populated by encyclopedists of all kinds and categories, with this mania, which accompanied the Industrial Revolution of let's catalog and map the whole world, or the known world, the colonial world being a part of that. And so the resources that they expended on this were gigantic. And that really formed, I would say, the basis for the capture by the nascent pharmaceutical industry of our medicinal plants. I mean, it did many other things as well, but certainly that's something that was a great loss to us. Right. So, just on the subject of color and nature, I wanted to also tell you about a small episode in around 2007 or 8 or so. In a few of the talukas of Goa, there are small temples whose walls and whose exteriors and sometimes interiors have a very simple art. That art is called Kavi, which is like a fresco art. I'm using the word fresco only in order to convey to you what it is. It's a single color, it's a solid color, it's dark red, which is visible on the wall, which may be, a tuna wall usually. And that represents an art form that is unique to the laterite rock-bearing districts of Western India. So right from Sindhudurg to Uttara Kannada. So in fact, you could say perhaps from Gokarn, but it goes on all the way until Udupi. I noticed it on one of the mandirs around the Sri Krishna Mandir in Udupi. So I've seen it all the way till there. And I was keen on finding ways to look for existing artists because what they were doing is then, in order to replicate it, they were simply going to the market and buying whatever Asian painter of red or red oxide and painting it. So what we did is we found, unfortunately in Goa there was nobody. We found a couple of chaps in Gokarn and Shirsi. And brought them to describe what it was. And what it is simply the powdering of our laterite, but there is a very strong plant element as well. There are two vines that are to be used, which actually help to fix the red color, which is called geru, onto the limestone. And there are two methods to do this. Either you incise the limestone, the tuna plaster, and then fill it in with the geru to the pattern, to whether it's whatever kind of pattern or drawing it is. Or the other way is that you make a sheet, you apply a sheet of geru and then you incise the drawing out of it. So there are these two ways. But I was keen that we find somebody to revive it in the form that it was meant to be. And interestingly, in Sawantwadi, there was the last of who would have been the ruling clan, Rani Satvashila Devi Bhosle. And she used to maintain this, and the museum is still there. There's a museum which has those famous Ganjifa cards. And she found somebody who was able to describe which vines it was. It was two vines or creepers that were used to fix the color to the limes, to the tuna. Because in the Gokarn it rains for 5 months a year. How is this thing going to remain applied to the tuna despite the rains? And unfortunately, that's where things lay, because I couldn't generate the funds needed to bring these people and run experiments as to how do we do this. But why I'm telling you all this is because of the primacy of color. So the creation of the pigment required the use of both mineral and plant.
Rahulji, there's a temple called Chitrasabha temple where they don't have Garbhagriha at all. The whole thing is just fresco painting of Shiva Purana types, and even outside it is completely filled with fresco painting of our Purana stories, even outside and inside. I heard that it was renovated by the ASI. I was thinking if you can throw light, because I know the ASI does a bad job. What did they do to, did they put some paints to do it? I don't know. It looks wonderful now, but then I don't know how they did it. Because the guard there told me they revived it, renovated the place. I thought perhaps you would know something about it.
No, I don't know. I don't know, but I should write you later and ask you for some details. Because, we know what ASI is like. ASI is, unfortunately, as was described to me a few years ago, ASI is a cement contractor. They love to reconstruct in cement. And the other thing with ASI is whenever they get into cahoots with a state administration of State Department of Culture, the first thing they do outside anything that they take over, which they want to open up to tourists, is to construct big, ugly toilets. It's absolutely mystifying. The first thing they do is construct these huge, ugly cement toilets. what we had hoped, what we hope to do is to be able to have some discussion today which will set a tone for what is to follow for this particular subject, whichever way it goes, whether it goes into Brihat or Saryu Trust or any other partners or with any other group, organization, Indic or otherwise. We don't know, but having brought to your attention this particular subject of the UN and multilaterals and how they work, and because of how they work, what it does to us as a country, what should we do and how should we go about it? I think that's something that if you could spend some time on as a kind of collective brainstorming.
Interesting story about the ASI, that this Bhangar fort that they talk about, like it's haunted and all that. So for the first time, you have the state telling you that here there are ghosts roaming around after dusk and before dawn. So don't venture out here. Now, I was very perplexed by this for a very long time during my younger days and everything, and I would keep asking everybody that what are they? Nobody seemed to be surprised that the state was telling you that they are ghosts. Otherwise, they say it's supernatural and you are bullshitting and kind of stuff. The state is here telling you that it is, there are haunted activities happening here. And the second thing is, then I came to know by somebody who's actually, his father was in the police and everything kind of thing. So I came to know this that actually there's smuggling activities that go on there at night. And so this ASI cahoots with the state government and with these smugglers and all that. They kind of shut this fort at night for all kind of illegal activities that they want to carry out there. And so that's how they fool the people. And now I think they're thinking of removing that board after the coming of this government.
When this particular thing was told to me by K.K. Muhammad, and he said that in fact in many places when the state government wants something constructed on the cheap, then they contact ASI who will construct it for them. So now it's going to be up to you as to how to proceed on this. There were a couple of things that I wanted to show you. So there were two documents I just quickly wanted to show you. In showing you the first, we'll finally get out of the way the whole subject of the UN. And in showing you the second, perhaps then I'll be able to fulfill this this request for the understanding the agri part of it better. So this is probably one of my last reports about how UNESCO work in Afghanistan. So this was in 2018. Now what I wanted to show you here is, this is all the usual introductory jargon that one is obliged to write. So this is something that I've struggled with trying to make the UN agencies and the agencies of the ML system recognize, let alone come to grips with, which is a later stage. How are we to approach the questions that we normally hold out to participants, culture, etc., against this sort of reality? As in, what is the immediacy of what we say versus the immediacy of what they experience? And if we don't talk about that and recognize that and bring that into anything that we do, we lose any sense of relevance to them. So this I have put down, here, both concerning this country and in all these other countries. I mean, it so happened that, whether it was Sri Lanka, Timor-Leste, Cambodia, Afghanistan, certainly to some extent Iran, these were all troubled, conflicted countries. And
this was in 2008, sir?
18. This happened in 18. Yeah. And the reason that I felt impelled to do this is because these agencies seemed to want very much to separate the reality of what was happening surrounding the lives of the tradition bearers from what they were delivering to them by way of their programs and so on. And I think it began to disturb me to the degree that it did, that in 2016 or so, I decided that I'm not going to follow their reporting formats anymore. I'm going to continue reporting to them, I mean, in the way that I thought was necessary. And I continue to do that, so that, you see, all these kind of reports that I've given, which go to the national authorities in whichever country it is, which go to the UNESCO offices, and then go into the UN depository system for all the reports. So this becomes part of the official record. And then hopefully, I thought that at some point when they have the General Assembly meeting of an agency, that this becomes cause enough for a member state, one country, or perhaps together with other countries, to say that, look, you've been doing this work, but have you taken note of the reality of the situation there and done something in accordance with what your own people are telling you from the ground? So that, to my knowledge, has not happened yet. And I think when I wrote things like this, whether for Afghanistan or other places, I did it with the intention that, since there didn't seem to be a visible system of review and assessment of, we are doing this work through a UN agency, using donor money with the approval of the member states, what monitoring and evaluation system do we have in that agency that actually assesses what the work that we are doing and its effect on the ground? We didn't seem to have any, not for 1 year, not for 2 years, not for any of the years, for any of the agencies. And this, I came to see, was a glaring omission. So this I found to be a glaring omission, and as I mentioned to you, the program cycle runs for 2 years in a UN agency, and one would expect that, all right, 2 years have passed, now let's review what we've done under this capacity building program, under this cultural program. That did not happen, and then it did not happen again, and it continued not to happen. There was no sign of it whatsoever. Having understood and realized that, I thought that, look, I know that these go into the official record, they are tagged, they're categorized, they are then become accessible to academics, and especially those who study the UN system and how it works. So I decided, again, something like a quasi-radical act of bringing to light really the way the omissions of the system, to put it directly in the reports itself, ignoring the diktat to stick to a format. As a UN mission official, which you are when under contract for that mission, you are obligated to follow the reporting formats. I simply ignored it. They did tick me off, but I didn't bother about the ticking off. I told them that according to my conscience, this is what needs to be said. Because if you send me there, I'm going to see this and I'm going to hear this. And since I'm seeing this and hearing this on your watch, I have to tell you what I've seen and heard. And this is how I'm going to do it. So I just stuck to my guns and continued reporting in this way. If you look at the format which they prescribed, which I don't have because readily, I don't have because it's in some hard disk somewhere, it dates back to about 2015, which I just completely ignored because I knew it was meant to truncate anything that was your own expression of what you saw and did. And this I felt was going against the grain of why we were there. So I continued to use this kind of approach, which I thought was, a very simple, ordinary approach, and especially also to make it digestible to the country officials. I mean, we're looking at, they are the first people to put this to use. UNESCO at the local level second, and UNESCO at the headquarters level third. And for the reasons that I was telling you about this tyranny of format, where I also described, this absurdity of capacity building for capacity building, training on how to use the form. for the reason of that, knowing that the country officials were already struggling with this welter of formats, I said, let me just not use those formats at all. Give a straightforward report which describes everything. So I would say that because of that, in fact, following in the latter period and even until now, I have been contracted directly by, for example, even with the government of Cambodia, with the Ministry of Culture and Fine Arts. I still have a running contract until this year to examine some of the documents that they produce for UNESCO. This is between me and them. UNESCO is not in the picture at all. I've done that also with Afghanistan, or rather they have done that. I have a running program with them, which is, of course, running only in the sense of technically it's not going anywhere because of the the continuing problems there. That has to do with traditional water conveyance methods, what are called karez. Karez is an underground structure that moves water from where the snow melt is to the habitation points. With Iran as well, it was direct. So these in fact vindicate this position that I took, which is that I have to speak to you in a language that you will find easy to understand and which you can make sense of, and whose content you can put to some use. So what I'm trying to show you here is that the reason I felt constrained to do this is because the agency itself refused to see the realities on the ground where it was carrying out its allegedly capacity building work in order to raise the encouragement level and support level for traditional knowledge, intangible cultural heritage or living heritage. And this is the kind of gross internal contradiction that exists in every single of these agencies. When you look at what they ask you to do and then how they process what you tell them has happened. So a great deal of what has happened, in fact, is excised, it is censored, it is cut out, it is edited. And even that then becomes part of the grist to their propaganda mill, which we've already gone through. So I use this as my radical way to get around it and get past it. So for this is all I wanted to show you, so that you get an idea about this. If at all you are interested in reading the whole thing, which is not so grisly and gruesome as these two preceding paragraphs, you're most welcome. I'll just distribute this. The other file, this is particularly relating to what Sushant was jumping up and down and demanding. Tell us about agroecology, tell us about agroecology. So this dates to, I think, 2017, and this has to do actually with a small group which included Jaya Jaitly of Dastakari Hath, and Ashok Chatterjee, who I got to know because he was also part of the governing board of Center for Environment Education, but because earlier also he was the head of NID. And the subject actually was the impact of GST on the craft sector, which was very severe. And we got together and said, with a number of other people who were very active in crafts, textiles, handicrafts and so on, to say that let's understand, let's try and get together to impress upon the Ministry of Finance that, look, please don't treat handicrafts and crafts and textiles in the way that you treat all the other industrial sectors, because they simply cannot handle it. So that was the work that we did for about a year and a half. Part of the work required us to communicate with the Ministry of Finance, for which I wrote this note.
In the Konkan, rice farmers had a very long ago found a way to deal with pests, which, like rice, which in Konkani is called ukade. As much as we do, they simply fed them. Every 9th or 10th row in the field used to be planted with a variety that attracts the biggest pests, stem borers. These rows were eaten, the others were left mostly untouched. Some years ago, I learned that the rice farmers in the Tanjavur region in Tamil Nadu used to do the same. When the hybrid rice cultivars came along, ICAR distributing these under names as catchy as those adopted by film stars. These practices began to wink out in in those rice fields of India in which once had grown the fat, short grains that were cooked unpolished. This is the this is the thought, knowledge and practice that began fading from our fields, and because it retreated from our fields, it began also to fade from our villages that had tilled the fields. When the Green Revolution came to displace with laboratory science and technique the knowledge streams that had so well served our civilization. When the rice was harvested, a portion of the stalks that remained were kept to feed cattle. The buffalo like these, especially when mixed with other leafy material, and the rice straw helped give them nutrition needed to do the heavy work our farmers asked them to. The hide varieties were called hide because of the larger and heavier grain end of the rice stalk. But our farmers look at matters differently. They look at the whole plant and what lies beneath in the soil and what remains after the straw and who feeds on it. Not only us, the productivity obsessed crop scientists did not look at the rice in this way during the high tide of green revolution and are much less inclined to today. If there was a rice mill that took the harvested grain too, the husk used to be returned. This was usually mixed with other green manure and returned to the soil, so returning the valuable minerals that had sustained the ukhade as panicles fattened. Now nothing is returned. The husk is sold by the miller as an ingredient for a fuel mix, or to the poultry farms, or to silica manufacturers. Nor is the barn returned. The miller extracts oil from this. This is the breaking of the material links in the rice cycle, all because of the productivity. Bigger grain, but not better. More material to sell, but poorer fields. Reading some of the official from the central government reports and deliberations on handicrafts and handweavers of recent years. This term product is found like a misfit, attempting to give some kind of authority to the description of an idea or a need. It is present in some of the reports. Working groups and steering committees prepared for the 12th five-year plan, a process in which for agriculture I had participated. What can productivity possibly mean for a craft? There is no machine, no production line, no workers, no ISO certified processes, no monthly target, no input output set of tables. Less recent but employing far friendlier terms in the description of crafts, fiefs, and kinds of knowledge from the medicinal and hydrological found in the gazetteers. The 1909 set of which is perhaps the most comprehensive. It was called Arts and Manufacturers almost 110 years ago, and is to my mind a far truer statement of the workings by people of materials found where they were lived, sustained themselves. In the 1951 census, the first of independent India, among the list of industries and occupations according to which the working population was described were herdsmen and shepherds, beekeepers, silkworm rearers, cultivators of lark, charcoal burners, collectors of cow dung, gatherers of seaweeds and water products, good manufacturers, I think this good manufacturers, but toddy drawers, tailors, gardeners, potters, and makers of earthware, glass bangles and beads. Because it is a list that still had everything about arts and manufacturers to it. This is likely to have helped the writers and planners of the second five-year plan, that is 1956 to 61, secure the government's acceptance in principle of the Stores Purchase Committee recommendations that certain classes of stores should be reserved exclusively for purchase from village and small industries, and that price differential should be allowed to them over the products of large-scale industries, and also that the production of certain varieties of cloth has been reserved for the handloom industry, and an excise duty has been levied on the production of large mills so as to build up a fund from which financial assistance has been given to handloom and khadi industry. All applications of substantial expansion of existing larger units or for establishment of new large units in leather, footwear, and tanning industries are examined in light of their possible effects on cottage and small scale sector.
So the first part, has to do with, as I've been trying to indicate to you about the wider dimension of what we mean by crop cultivation. And then it moves on to trying to show the Ministry of Finance officials that we have had instances of the government mind. You remember my talking to you about the overmind of the UN multilateral system, but here of the government mind when it was still relatively untainted by the UN multilateral system, to look in fact at our wondrous variety of natural produce, which relates very much to what you were saying, Gayatri, about the jati. And if you look at this, to my mind, this was in fact the continuing recognition of jati even in the official language, and the importance of what they do. So this was really the approach with which I thought a communication to the Ministry of Finance Babus could be written. It was, I mean, at the end of it, after about 1.5 years, I think it was only partly successful. They agreed to move some handicap, basically from a higher slab, I think it was 15 to the 5% slab. But they still didn't take away the obligation of reporting, which more than 90% of small and artisanal crafts people find it impossible to do, because you have to hire somebody to do it, and that hiring of that somebody costs money, and then you need the time to follow it up, receive the returns, file them, do something with them, then apply for exemptions and all sorts of things. So it just entraps you in a maze of GST related red tape. But the reason I wanted to show you this is just to illustrate the part about, in the first place, about the crop cycle, what we call the crop cycle. The actual cereal and crop that we eat is only one part of it. The fodder that we get from the stalks and the other uses that the stalks are put to, which is why the whole rush to mechanization of agriculture has in fact caused so much disturbance, because then the stalk is treated as waste. In the same way as I was discussing with you about Baden-Powell's radical or cataclysmic sort of recategorization of land, where he invented this term of wasteland. And now we have waste stock, on waste leads to crop stubble and so on. And you know what happens to crop stubble over here. It's never meant to happen. So these are, I think, the wider questions that unfortunately crop up whenever we lose or when we veer away from the cultural dimensions that surround and direct all our activities. Which is something that I found very difficult to convey to the administrators and policymakers, because wedded as they are to the idea of a particular kind of progress and a particular kind of route to development and so on, that when we do have abundant evidence of what progress and so-called development is, in earlier times, we've been talking about the wondrous layouts and riches and social orders of the cities of Vijayanagar, Anhilwada, and so on. It's all there in as a corpus of literature to be dipped into at any time. But we've still taken on, or rather, they have still been so immersed in this the overmind of the UN and ML system that they seem to have lost it entirely. I don't really know whether this kind of communication has had any kind of impact. It did in the short term, but whether anybody will ever go back, any junior secretary will ever go back and say, let me look at what these people have written and draw some lessons from it, we don't know. Perhaps that is where, what we were talking about, bring the babus together and subject them to a high radiation blast of this kind of thing. That may help. I don't know, but that's something that, we all need to put our minds together to.
We're talking about this green revolution. I entirely agree with you when you say that the normal cropping patterns which were there earlier have now been set aside subsequent to the Green Revolution. But we also know that the problems we had of food production and the continuous state of rice milta hai, atta milta hai, and famines. Some year you get good production, some year you don't get. And we have seen really bad days. I have also seen bad days when India has faced a number of famines. Thanks to the Green Revolution, we have many things against it. Today we have enough food grains to feed our people and maybe a little bit of the world also. So as I can see, the old methodology of crop production and dependence upon rain did not really succeed in ensuring a continuity of food grains for our public. So if you wish that the old system should be maintained, then we have to suggest a way in which our production of grains will be sufficiently high, especially considering the number of people the mouths we have to feed. So simply saying that हाँ पुराने में जमाने में बहुत बढ़िया था, we agree. But how do we translate it today when I have to feed 150 crore people? So this is something. So what we require is actually suggestions as to how we can have the older methodologies which were nature friendly to the so-called scientific ones today. Have you any suggestions for that? Or should we take that up as the next step?
Colonel, I worked for 5 years with the Ministry of Agriculture between 2009 and 2013. And my role there on that project was to collect and document traditional cultivation practices for ICAR. The rationale behind that particular project was that ICAR has what is called a formal science, which it practices in its institutes. And at that time, Ministry of Agriculture administrators and the senior members of ICAR who were entrusted with this project agreed that there was still at that time a considerable body of traditional crop cultivation knowledge which existed, and they agreed which needed to be brought onto the same footing as the formal sciences of plant cultivation, in order that when kisans ran into problems with their crop, pest infestation, soil degradation, whatever it was, that they could be free to choose which system they wanted to use or which system they wanted to draw from. This was in fact the entire rationale of that program. And at that time I was quite happy to see that, because I thought that here finally we have an administration in ICAR which wants to go ahead with what they are equipped and trained to do, but also take notice of what has existed and what continues to exist, which has its roots in our cultural approach to cultivation. Unfortunately, that didn't last beyond the end of the project, because that once again was only until the project finished, and then thereafter it became a project that has been done, let's move on. You know, what you are saying about the gains of the Green Revolution, I think this is perhaps because there is less attention that has been placed on when the Green Revolution began, because the famine and the food scarcity situations in India, a lot of it during the 50s, I was certainly not there, I was born in 65, but during the 50s and 60s, continued because of what had happened during the Second World War years, when the large volumes of rice from the middle to lower Gangetic belt, from Bengal and from Burma, from British Burma, which was also British India province, were all diverted for the war cause. And this is one of the reasons why the 1943 famine, which I heard about directly from my father and his parents, who were from Bengal, was attributed very much to the Churchillian diktat that remove rice from India, send it to our allied troops. And what a lot of people, agronomists, economists who studied agricultural economics and multilateral trade, what they often fail to see, in the same way that I was describing earlier, what UNESCO fails to see from the reality on the ground, is that the effects of a famine on the generational order carry on for a very long time. So, when a family loses people, they die of hunger. Others, in order to just maintain or repair what they had, will look for any way in order to earn something. If they cannot go back to their fields, which is often the case, because there's just not enough support to do that, then they will immediately rush to the town to earn something. The fields lie fallow. We know from experience that returning a field that has lain fallow for even 2 to 3 years back to what it was before year zero is very difficult. It requires a lot of labor. That labor has to be paid. So what I'm getting at is that the socio-cultural effects of a famine cast a shadow on the following 10 to 15 years, which it becomes very difficult to recover from if it's not recognized. So this is one aspect. The other aspect, which is a technical aspect, is that the Green Revolution states were introduced to the so-called dwarf varieties of rice and wheat. Neither of which, rice, for example, I'm more than halfway through writing a manuscript on this particular subject, including the life of R.H. Richarya, who was the head of the Central Rice Research Institute, who is really one of the towering giants of cultivation and rice cultivation in India. And he, along with others and his group, had strongly, bitterly opposed the introduction of what are called the Taiwan varieties of rice into India, which are dwarf varieties. I have seen myself in North Bengal, in parts of Bengal adjoining what is today Bangladesh, rice plants of 8 feet high. In the 1980s in the Konkan, I have seen rice plants which are 5.5 feet high. Today, if you look at rice plants in the field, they're this high. And this is the difference. I see it as a cultural difference. We have in our national gene banks, we are supposed to have 30 to 35,000 cultivars, not counting the numerous accessions of them. And where are they being in fact grown? These are everything relating from, the entire gamut of medicinal plants, of what we call immunity boosters and everything is all present there. But if you look at our most popular so-called variety of rice, excluding Basmati, in the rest of India, it's a variety called Sona Masuri. Why on earth is this, does this have the dominance it does? So these I certainly see as various effects of the Green Revolution methods and technology. I think these need to be certainly better understood, not so that we say that one approach is good and all others are bad and that is good and all before it was bad, but to look at where mistakes were made and to not make them again. I have nothing against appropriate technology where it can be used. During the time that I spent with the Center for Environment Education, Himalaya, where we worked with Department of Rural Development, we used to spend quite a lot of time, especially in the hill states, convincing people to abandon their horribly designed chulas where they were choking and adopting better chulas which would ventilate the rooms better. So, I think it's not a matter of either or, but finding a via media that can give us better life without us compromising on our cultural foundations.
I agree, sir. There's a need to find a via media because you talked of 43. You have not seen the famines of 55 in Bihar. You're not born. I've come to the world a little earlier than you, so I remember this. I also know the problems India faced in 64, 65, also in 71, 72. We have been having famines all through. And we used to import literally ship to ship. We were living on ship to ship.
To mouth it was
Those,
40.
yes. Used to land in Bombay port
Yeah.
and used to get. So I've seen these things. It's only after the 80s that our things have improved. Therefore, green revolution has done a great lot of good for us. But as you say, agree 100%. There's a need to find a via media. And regarding your cottage industries, I have been dealing with small scale industries, going to the villages. साबुन बनाते हैं कढ़ाई में. So he'll make 40 kilos in that kadai, and the 40 kilos in another kadai, and all the soaps will be different. So when you require in larger quantities, and the expectations of the person who is going to consume that soap is completely different from what is being produced in the cottage industry. It must have been perfectly fine, say 100 years back, caustic soda बना के, fat लगा के बना दिया. आज के जो लोग हैं, they will not accept that soap. This is my personal feeling. With the result, we had to go in for mechanization, we had to go in for a Godrej soap or a Synthol soap or something. It's a fact. Ask if, I doubt if any of these ladies would ever like to have that kadai soap. My घर में रखता था, and I found it was much better at washing clothes, but not for having bath. So these are practical things. So wonderful as it sounds, of continuing with the village practices and giving, telling people, yeah, khadi se banao. Wonderful things. But in actual practice, how do we merge it with the present day requirements or demands or the likes and dislikes? So this is something I would love to listen to you about.
There is, I think, in the last 3 to 4 years, a very large number of small producers of soap, what they call handmade soap, who are able to assure you of a very nice, well-made product, well-formed, well-packaged, whose materials are certified as being organic, as being pure, and which are certainly have a premium price to them, which people are willing to pay nowadays because they are seeing that the effects of the overuse of chemicals in the mass-produced soap is in fact harming them. It's harming their skin, it's harming their hair, it's harming youngsters, children and babies. So I think on the ground we are seeing that sort of shift in perception as well. To my mind, certainly leaving aside, the ideology of the small, to my mind, certainly these are huge opportunities for a revival or a renaissance of the micro industry, which is based on cultural foundations, but which adopts new techniques, new marketing techniques, new financing techniques, as we've seen with startups, the whole kind of startup economy, and new appeals to the desire for a more younger audience to find meaning in their lives from ordinary objects of daily use, objects of routine use. They certainly find, I think they find it more pleasurable to use that kind of a soap rather than a Rexona, because, as we've been saying yesterday, that the transformation of the elements does something to you personally, it does something to your body.
I was aware of the agricultural part, how the UN and such things, their poverty alleviation things affects India and other states. its harmful effects and all those multilateralism, literally making the other states adopt a UN global system laws. So that, and even on environment, basically the rich states don't want to cut down their carbon footprint, but want us to equally cut down, have an equal footing, sort of a cut down on carbon footings. But whereas they are the most polluting states. So this differential system that we have been always insisting in, they have been trying to not adopt it. So I had always sort of felt that it is more, UN is more used as exporting a standard for all our developing countries, and whereas the commerce for the developed countries. I mean, that is the way UN has been used as a vehicle for that. Now, then Rahulji now put together, exposed us to his experiences in UNESCO. That is something very eye-opening as to how they have this very feel-good sort of ideals of promoting tradition and traditional practices in all the states, like all the countries, like basically their thrust is on the developing nations. So, but what actually happens is they want those traditional practices to be sort of conveyed in the language they understand, or they want it to be practiced. So it's not as though the indigenous people have their practices, and it's not in the language as the indigenous people or the knowledge bearers they see it. It is in the language of the global community or the UN. So that is a big dichotomy, or rather, I would say, a big problematic area which kills the very tradition. So it kills the very knowledge base. For example, I would like here to say, then Rahulji importantly pointed out, they don't even consider language here as a traditional science or a traditional practice. In fact, language is a cultural, they are vehicles of culture, and they don't do that. So that completely puts away the whole purpose of having this UNESCO and traditions. What they are actually wanting is to sort of collect data and put it across, make them feel good, have them in the museums or something of that kind, but actually killing the very basic indigenous practices. And many are times, and I've also seen that there is no livelihood that is generated through these practices. It's very important that livelihoods is generated so that it can be sustainable on its own without any dilution in the traditional practice. That is a large, at least having a big essence of it there. It's not that you mechanize. For example, we have handlooms in the south. Wonderful saris they make with beautiful patterns. Now I have come across many people suggesting that we should mechanize some part of it and then have the designs but mechanize it. But that would kill the very purpose of the art. You make something with your own hands, and it is, as Rahulji put it, it is your own service to the spiritual divine. Like you make something, it's like we make murtis and we pray. It is like that. So you lose that very art if you don't make it with your own hand and the science behind it. And being organic, you don't need to use those commercial dyes and all those things. Like it's all fully organic. That is one part of it. Now to come to the point that how do we resist it? And then of course we spoke about how UN Women is again a big thing of literally it aims at destroying the very kutumbas. Like it pits a man against a woman and the parents against children, using children as a commodity, as we saw in Greta Thunberg's case, and I mean, using all those things. Yusuf Malala, they are sort of propped up as some kind of idols, right? And creating problems within our own society, creating basically anarchism, and then invention of many genders. I heard now there are some 62 or 64 genders. I really can't understand what it means. And now people even identifying themselves as wolves and dogs. That's what I've been told. So where does it lead us to? Bestiality? I question that. Whatever. So it has to stop somewhere. How do we do it? Now the problem, as I look at, we cannot completely shut it out because they say it is a world body. So if we completely shut it out, you get labeled as you are rogue state or something. Now, how do we neutralize it? That's how I put it. How do we neutralize the bad ill effects of a global body which wants to see us as one of the global community, a uniformity? How do we resist it? Then I thought about it. How do we? Because many of the schemes run through the government. Now, how do we do that? Like, how do we sort of consult with the government to sort of see to it that the traditional practices are supported and encouraged? For this, we need to sensitize our bureaucrats, politicians, and deep down, I would say, even the schools, because schools are the places where children are taught things. Perhaps we should go and even have these kind of workshops with some younger bureaucrats, like pick them up and then expose them to the dangers that these UN bodies throws at us, so that we can make them sensitive to the real original problems like culture. How should we maintain our cultures? So this kind of outreach would help us to have policies which can neutralize this UN multilateralism, as I put it, and so that we don't have our own state laws mimicking the global system. That's what is happening now, mimicking it literally. So that stops. So that's how I look at it. Now, Colonel Ramaji, he raised a very important issue that we need, like in terms of agroeconomy, how do we balance out the yield and the organic way of farming, the traditional factor of farming? In this, I found Rahul ji coming up with a very good solution, saying that our basic organic rices, right, the red rice, for example, when we consume, we need to consume only a little bit of it. It's very nutritious and very organic without all the chemical problems associated with it, and it's filling too. We don't need to consume in the large quantities that we get from polished rice. So this is something we need to propagate more so that we can get away from this. And another more important thing that I feel that we need to look at is because of this GM crops. GM crops will completely destroy agriculture in India, not only in India, all parts of the world. I mean, the Africans are not trying to spread more view because I find in videos also, so many of them, they have started speaking against it. But it's unfortunate that our government is going ahead implementing now. We have GM mustard now being introduced in GM foods. So that again is a problematic area. So I think we need to address the whole thing.
Looking at the multilateralism, the institutional structure and infrastructure that is in place, which kind of leads to all these certain consequences that Gayatri just mentioned. So when we look at those, as Rahulji pointed out, that it was actually shocking for him to see that most of these, countrywide or even nationwide initiatives led by the UN is mostly having this influx of young people, like 25 to 30 years old, who probably would not have any experience, would not have any depth, and they are being pushed into to just take care of in a mechanical form such a wide scope of coverage, which is nationwide, international, and even the, for that matter, the state kind of a thing set up. So that was something which really boggled my mind, that how could a 25 or 30-year-old, just fresh out of some academic institution, know what exactly the issues are. And then the other thing that Rahulji pointed out too was this formatted way, or this very strict and rigid way of reporting. The UN wants it in a particular way which suits their purpose and suits the purpose of their organization and its top members, basically, not even the member states. So that kind of strict, makes you into a very rigid, mechanical kind of a reporting, which makes no sense at the end of the day, except for propagating their own mission of world dominance and hegemony, is how I see it. So there's no room for any kind of actual work for which they kind of propagate or make a perception that they're harbingers of truth, of morality, of ethics, and they're keeping like the holy see, like they're looking at everybody and they're keeping an eye, and we will take stock of what is humanity, human, and everything in this whole world. And we are still the neo-colonial institution. From its history point of view, from the League of Nations, what they did to the other ravaged nations, these top, allied powers and all those sitting together. So what they did and how it led to the Second World War also, and then they morphed into this United Nations organization. So, as Rahulji pointed out, in most of the instances that he was on the ground, he actually saw that what they propagated, like peacekeeping and cultural and education upkeeping and whatever, it was actually the opposite that was happening there. Like you see a military tank bang in the middle of a ravaged, Iraq or Iran or anything, and they say we are peacekeeping. So, I mean, how does that work? You don't strengthen that government, but you, with military force, you want to keep peace, but then you condemn that very military force in any other country which opposes you. So it's a very ironic and a very, hegemonic and neo-colonial kind of a way of looking at things and saying that my way is the right way, your way is not the right way, which is a repetition of the colonial mindset. And so then we moved on to another thing, where can China be a case study? Like how it's looking into the eye of the UN, especially the US, and they are actually handicapped in trying to deal with them because they've infiltrated everywhere, even in the academia, market, etc. And then, very rightly, Rahulji also pointed out, which gives us, that's the whole point of these conferences, that you get different perspectives and your questions get answered. So, as Rahulji has worked very closely with the UN, and he pointed out that China is actually a master of illusions. So, whatever they are putting across might not be the real thing. Like they've totally commercialized and standardized this Chinese traditional medicine, which militates against the very purpose of that traditional medicine. So all this needs to be taken into account, and China has a very cynical and a gradual, kind of a partnership with the UN, as you said. So then the perception management that United Nations has, kind of, how they bombard you with all these Malalas and the Gretas and all this. So you just type in something in Google like Malala Yousafzai or Greta Thunberg, and you get it all. As Gayatri rightly pointed out, it's the balkanization of the family. Like you make the child and the wife, an identity separate from the man, and the man, where he goes, nobody really knows. Like he's not even worth of being taken stock of. And so then they kind of put this across, that you have to be rebellious children, like Greta is screaming, her photos are all screaming, and Malala has to be this kind of a women's right activist that kind of looks at everything from the angle of a woman. So these are not our Indic outlooks, very rightly. And how the UN is a supranational entity is something which really baffles one's mind, like it's this multilateral thing, the state and then the country and then the UN. So whatever they sit and make in those General Assembly kind of treaties or whatever, it has to be trickle down. It's like a top-bottom approach, which is pushed. And also this enclavization, as Rahulji pointed out, in Cambodia and all these, you see that a UN sets up an enclave in all these countries to take care of their, their moral kind of bindings, and then they become a separate UN territory on its own in that very country quest, and it completely undermines their own sovereignty, and then it becomes so. It's like a parasite that sucks out the very vitality of that very country, and you see that they become fat, wealthy, and they become all these office bearers, and you see a Lexus pulling up in the middle of a ravished country, and those belong to this. So the corruption that happens at the lower level or whatever. So that was something which really baffled. And I think why I'm pointing out all these is because as a person who came here with a question in her mind, that this UN and multilateralism, like how does it affect the governance and the sovereignty, and what is its effects, what exactly does it do, how does it function from the very within? And that's what Rahul ji pointed out, which is very necessary to know, that they kind of collect the budget, the entire burgeoning machinery that you have there running, all the staff is paid from a budget that is collected from the member states, and they have a minimum budget that they have to submit. Most of them are running in arrears. They're constantly they're running short of budget for what, for this extension. So it's a skeleton, kind of infrastructure that is running with a very kind of a you might say evil design plus commerce, or anything, you can join them both together, but it's ultimately for the benefit of the ones running it. That's how they look at it. And so most of the budget is used up for their own staff purposes rather than anything else. And so where does the sovereignty in this decision making lie with this supranational imposition? I mean, when we make any laws or policies today in our country, we have to look at the UN's definition. Like, what does it define governance as? What does it define human rights as? What does it define? So we are looking at a different point of view always, rather than our own definitions being defined. So this is how supranational entity is so much, into everybody's, even the ground level decision making. And how do we negotiate this entity's encroachment over our decision making? How do we get a seat at the table? As Rahul ji said, that table was never ours, so we have to keep fighting for it. And how do we sit down and negotiate as these countries and get our way through? Because when you bring an Indic perspective or a cultural perspective at the table, as Rahul ji said, they look at you as if you are some other person, or you some other worldly person, and they outrightly reject you. So I think that is one thing we need to just completely thrash this perception that we have in our mind of them being the upholders of justice, equality, human rights, and education, and women rights, and all this. They're actually doing what is opposite, is what I came to know in these 3 days. And they have a huge chunk of the publicity and perception management that goes on, and which China exploits very well. And China is kind of following the same model. And yeah, so these vague terminologies that they use, like peacekeeping and education for all, women rights for all, is a very vague thing. I mean, you don't understand. Capacity building for the sake of capacity building, and training for the sake of training, means there's a administrative machinery process that has to keep repeating, because ultimately it's not for the benefit of mankind, it's for the benefit of a certain country that is there. So yeah, so the what is the genesis of this UN Women? What do you mean by best interests? We are working in the best interests of this. What is their definition? Who defines it? Where does it come from? What is it leading to? There's no explanation. Very vague terms which people can't question. Like, if I question, why are you working in their best interest? Why are you working for peacekeeping? I say, oh my God, you're such a fascist and you're such a this. So they've made it very well. Can't even question them. And then you say, why are you using Malala? Oh my gosh, she got a bullet in her head. Don't you feel sad for her? So all those kind of things. So the architecture and everything is all built in such a way, right from the administration to the leadership, is all something which is. So then at the end of the whole 3 days is what I got, is this wonderful thing that Rahul ji says, is that the spiritual connection between the hand of man and the substance of nature as it appears to us in this loka, the Panch Mahabhuta, how do we join those two? And how do we make national, international levels, of decision making for the benefit and interest of mankind? Ultimately, that's where we have to live, and where we have to make a better environment, and we are all working towards it. So this hand of man and the substance of nature that connect, and how we, as modern, quote unquote, modern mechanicians and all those things that are institutions, infrastructure that is used, how do we develop a dharmic, shastric perspective of leadership to kind of make sure that these Pancha Mahabhutas and spiritual connection between the hand of man and the substance of nature in this loka, how do we look at it from that perspective? We report from that perspective and connect these two together and work. Nobody is saying that it's a bipolar thing that either you go back traditional completely or you become totally modernized. There is a middle ground which has to come from the leadership, and then that kind of changes the entire infrastructure or the administration or the kind of the whole mechanization and process, which is very much possible. It just requires the intent and the right people who are there to do this. And that is, every action is to be done as a duty and responsibility which connects us to the Paramatma. And if we do that with that, I think our life is set. So, as Gayatri said, the only way we see is that for more of these kind of conferences and seminars to be held, so that till it becomes a proper established procedure and institution which talks about this, deliberates about it every 6 months or 1 year, and then we can go and tap into those people in the administration or the politics sphere and see who have this dharmic and shastric perspective, which is kind of submerged, or it is suppressed, and they're not able to take it out. Talk to them and get them to come and attend these, take part in it, and take the learnings from here and engage more, and and move towards that goal that we are looking for a more dharmic, shastric, and more fulfilling human experience on this earth, which will take us closer to the four purushartha, which is moksha at the end. That's all we all want at the end of the day. What I understood was that there is a requirement to give structure to the thought process that we've discussed here so far in 3 days. And I was able to make a structured overview of things, which, of course, and structure, but then these small instances that sort of give the meat of what has been spoken here has been very well covered. So, I think Rahulji's talk was to some effect a whistleblower's account to the performative and superficial role that UN plays in India and other countries that are economically vulnerable. With India doing well economically, credit hogging seems to be their new mode of keeping their power maintained. Whether it be the vaccination drives or whether it be Digital India. So I think it amplifies that through strategic and well marketed social media campaigns. The power of UN, in my opinion, through what I was able to understand by Rahulji's talk, which, sort of left loose these very big and very colorful balloons that you have to hop onto because they're very appeasing, these ideas that he's left in the air for us. It lies on 4 pillars. Like I said, the marketing and the penetration to the depths of the countries that UN has. I think it's only second to Nestle's Maggie. And then there is this hefty wads of cash, prestige, and stability that they stuff into the mouths of those that attempt to call out their hogwash. And they do that by giving them jobs which are in some cases irrelevant and in almost all cases very high maintenance. Then I think the second thing would be catalyzing on, the third thing would be capitalizing on dwindling traditions and diminishing languages as points of insertion for appropriated UN jargon and buzzwords to fill the loophole systematically and seamlessly, which has been their modus operandi since the 50s. And then capitalizing on the sensitivity and paternal instincts and tendencies of common people by making children as mascots of their sinister neo-colonial intent. Solutions to this has been a very big challenge that we've been speaking of. I find them to be plain and simple, namely economic success, making machinery which allows vigilance on UN activities as well as holds them answerable, and widening the myopic view of the permanent executive, which is the bureaucracy.
In this post maybe globalized world, post Second World War especially, Escobar writes particularly about how development as a construct was developed by the colonial powers to reinterpret their intervention into the new colonial world, especially the third world countries that were there. And what I felt after I've started reading him, that we need to take stock of what development actually means. And with institutions like International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, where development is the very important word that they highlight, which Rahulji particularly focused on, that what is the mandate and what is the true focus of such organizations. We need to understand, as a, I won't say a third world country, but a country who is rising up in this world, that how do we look at development, and whether the role of these multilateral organizations is important or functional even in this society. Interpretation of culture then is the second point that I feel is very, very important. But what they say, that if you don't interpret it for yourself, they would interpret it for you. And when we discussed what an intangible culture is, the definitions and interpretations given by the United Nations fail miserably to understand what intangible cultures are. In many cases that he revisited from his field days and work in Cambodia, work in Sri Lanka, work in Iran, work in India itself, these societies are deeply rooted and connected to their own culture, their soil, their religion, which is of a polygamous nature, which is sometimes very alien to the Abrahamic and the colonial mind that interpreted. So we need to understand that how we interpret our culture. Sovereignty, for that matter, then again becomes an important thing. Are we diluting our sovereignty by becoming members or becoming in cahoots with these multilateral organizations? And how do we understand the basic idea of sovereignty? And we had a very jovial but serious discussion about the Westphalian nature and post-Westphalian world, and how sovereignty is interpreted in that sense. And as a nation who has fought the colonial powers and sacrificed so much for its independence, we need to understand that sovereignty is a very primary basis of our existence in this world. I also feel globalization is reversing. If you observe the current trends of the world, and in this post globalized world, as I would like to say, we need to assert, protect, and interpret our own sovereignty in the lens of what these multilaterals do. Most of the times, diluting it. So that is the second point that I would like to make. In terms of commerce, which again is an important part when it comes to multilateral organizations, because we have organizations like IMF, WTO, WHO, or FAO, or many other organizations that have an interplay and a conversation that happens continuously on a commercial sense with all the nation partners that are there. Are we revisiting the practices that have been common and acceptable to these all member nations, and which have been detrimental and deteriorating when it comes to especially agriculture, which was kind of a focal point because of his expertise and his love for that same subject? And I pushed him also, I think, in a positive way, I would say this towards that in the end of the conference, that how agriculture has been a point of contention and conflict, especially for this nation. And in that sense, I would go again to the idea that Aruto explains, and development, and how does it interplay, and what is your idea of development? Especially, we were discussing the other day regarding Vanavasis, that you can't give them a cell phone and say this is a developed idea and you should adopt it, because you should really understand and ask yourself, does the man really need it? Here by man, I mean all people, not like particular man. And one more thing is that are we indulging, or are we practicing what kind of commerce are we indulging into? Because in this foray of climate change that is happening, all these things, and their mitigation of climate change and our mitigation of climate change also has to be reinterpreted and understood more indigenously by us, regeneratively by us, looping in our practices and not blindly following the global cabal who just uses climate change as a action point to earn more money, or keep running these systems which are most of the times not concerned about real outcomes of how to mitigate climate change, with a huge bureaucracy that just then is just sustained because there is a need of it. Uh, Broader line, I would like to conclude that in sense, what interventions do these multilaterals play on a national stage for countries like India, and how we should be aware of their interventions, and how much should we allow, because you cannot escape them. That is a sad reality. We cannot totally say that, oh, we would become an isolationist nation and like North Korea not even allow anyone. I think that is a very radical stance to take, but an assertive nationalist identity which roots into viable and sensible economic policies rooted in culturally oriented and culturally directed policy and public policy making, which then is very aware and informed of these multilateral intentions, as I would like to say, and how where do they lead us on this global governance schema. I think on that note, this has been the most insightful and with such an erudite scholar like Rahulji himself, I look to more of such interactions, which would lead to deliberations and more policy papers. I expect the participants and myself to be contributing to. Again, that would be a bureaucratic exercise, but writing, I think, helps to articulate and condense ideas into informing the other people. We have to project the ideas and has to be public facing so that people understand what has been happening in these kind of conferences. Gayatri ji rightly pointed out that there has to be an information based connect to the bureaucracy also. If the state is not taking it up, organizations like Brihat and Sharayu should take it up, because I think it's our modal responsibility to inform the bureaucrats who are aligned to the betterment of this country.
Thanks so much then for putting together these summaries. I mean, at least, now we have, I think, something tangible to work on intangibly. And I think that this really helps give us some direction as to where this can go. I have to admit that at the outset, I wasn't at all sure of whether the participants would find it worthwhile to listen to, find some value in it, and think about and be able to think about, much less be convinced, whether this is something worth their while and their time after this. So I'm really happy to hear all this, because I think that you all have been really wonderful to have around me for these days, including the ones who were there for the 2 days and who weren't able to stay after that. Because, as I've said, I think on every single day, I really did not dream that it would be possible to have a small group of people to simply listen to what one person, that is me, has seen and done in all these places, and relate what it meant when I had the time and when I began to gather the wit to reflect on it. What I had participated in contributed to something. What was that contribution? Was it in a good way, in a good cause or a bad cause? Who did it affect? And what was the result of that effect? And I think this is something that in anything that I wrote, naturally in anything that I wrote to UNESCO, it was impossible to put this down. But in other attempts to do it, this became usually an academic exercise which went into, some panel discussion, and it turned out into, it reached the light of print through some conference proceeding. And you know what happens to conference proceedings? They become what in the old days of the press, we used to call it a Raddiwala special, which, makes the Kuda Kabadi wala happy, but nobody else. So this was the big question. Where does it go? Can anybody make use of it? I felt strongly, I was convinced, in fact, that somebody should and would make use of it, but how? My attempts to, as I've mentioned, contact MEA, for example, on telling them what I had learned about the various operations of the Chinese the great cultural machinery, they were simply not returned. I mean, it was like talking to a blank wall. Think tanks who I thought would be interested in having a perspective needed it to be couched again in a particular framework, geostrategic, etc., which I have no idea about. I have no clue about that language and what needs to be said and what does not need to be said. So I simply wanted to relate it as I had seen it and lived it. And thanks to Brihat and Sharayu Trust, I was able to do that, for which I am very grateful indeed. But even more than that, I'm grateful to you all for having sat through patiently these 3 days and listened to this rather large outpouring of personal history. I have to call it a personal history. I've tried to give you the various connections that relate to this evil thing we call UNML, but it is actually a personal history. I don't see any other way to say it. And I think what you've been able to do this just now with making a summary of it and saying, right, we've understood this much, now let's use it in this way. I think that's very good. Let's I'd leave it to Brihat and Sharayu Trust to give it a bit of thought and a little more shape for the months to come. So thank you all very much.